In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural scratch metal material. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the video description. So after I show you how to create the procedural material, we'll be joining it together into this custom node group. So we have this scale value to change the size of the entire material. So you can change the size depending on the size of your object. And then we also have the scratches scale, and this is just the size of the scratches. Then we also have the amount of scratches. So you can see I can have a lot more scratches or less scratches. And then we have scratches size 1, so I can make them kind of bigger or smaller, and then also scratches size 2, which is kind of going to make the scratches look a little bit longer. Then we have two different colors for the metal, so you can have a little bit of variation, color 1 and color 2. So they're both just kind of some gray colors, but you can add a bit of variation if you want to kind of make the metal look a bit more rusted. You could make it kind of like an orange or a brown. Then we also have the metallic value. Then we just have a noise scale, and then a noise detail, and then also a noise roughness. Then we have the roughness of the metal, so you can make it really shiny or you can make it really rough. Then we have the scratches bump strength, so you can turn this up if you want the scratches to be more bumpy. You could even turn it up to a really high value if you want the scratches to be really bumpy. Then we have the noise bump strength, which is just some noise over the entire metal to make it look kind of worn. And then we also have the noise bump strength 2, which is also just some bits of noise over the material. And then we also have the scratches rotation, so you can rotate the scratches. So right now they're going up and down, but you can kind of rotate them around on the X, Y, and Z axis. So if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get it with the links in the video description. You can also check out my ultimate Blender procedural material pack if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials. You can also check out my procedural material packs, which are just packs of 10 materials, and I do also have a procedural metal material pack, which comes with a bunch of different metal materials. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist. So before we start, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I just added an icosphere, and then right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I turned the subdivisions up to 6 so it's nice and smooth, and I shaded the object smooth, and then I'll scale the object down by a 0.2 and then apply the object scale, so that's a better size when modeling to the real life scale in Blender. Then I also added a camera and I just pointed the camera at the sphere, and if you go over to the object data properties of the camera with the camera selected, I turned the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom the camera in a little bit. I like a higher focal length. And then also here on the output properties, I set the resolution to 1920 by 1920, so it is square with a 200 resolution, so it's just a nice large image. Now for the lighting, I added in this hotel room HDRI from polyhaven.com, so links in the video description if you want to download it, and I downloaded the 1K HDR version. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color and choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button to open up the HDRI, and then I turned the strength of the HDRI down to 0.5 so it wasn't quite as bright. And then also if you go up here to the render properties, let's go into the rendered view, I'm going to open up the film tab and I'm going to turn on the transparent button just so you can't see the HDRI in the background, but it'll still light the scene. And then also here on the color management, I'll be using filmic and very high contrast. So I'm going to click over here to go to the shading workspace, and I'll go into the rendered viewport mode. So I have the 3D view over here and then the shader editor over here. So I'll just select the object and let's add a new material. And you can just rename the material. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have that enabled, you can click on edit, you can go to the preferences, and here in the add-ons tab, just search for Node, and you can just enable the Node Wrangler add-on and then close Blender's user preferences. So to start off, we are going to search for a wave texture, and the wave texture is going to be the base for the scratches. So let's Control Shift select the wave texture, preview it, and then I'll hit Control T with the wave texture selected, and that's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And I'm going to put the object into the vector because the object coordinates is going to place the textures on the object more evenly. Now I like to keep my nodes nicely organized, so I'm going to add frames. So I'm going to click and drag to box select these nodes, and I'll hit Control J to join them together into a frame, and then I'll press F2 to give a label to the frame, and I'll just call this mapping just to keep things really organized. So those are the mapping nodes which will be plugged up to all the textures. Now what I'm also going to do is search for another mapping node, and I'll drop this mapping after the first mapping but before this other wave, and we can now use this mapping to just change the wave texture settings, but then this mapping will be used to change the size of the entire material, but this mapping will be just for the wave. So I'm going to turn the scale to 6, and I'll turn this distortion up to 4 so that way the scratches will look a little bit distorted, and also I'll turn the detail to 12 so they're going to be pretty detailed. Now what I want to do is add a noise texture after the wave to make it really noisy and have lots more of the scratches. So I'm going to search for a noise texture and drop it here after the wave. So because this wave texture is going through the vector, it's going to distort the placement of the noise texture. However, that doesn't really look good, so I want to fix this. So what I'm going to do is use a really cool trick. If I just drag the noise texture here, so we have more space in between the textures, what I'm going to do is add a separate XYZ, and then also I'm going to add a combine XYZ. So we're going to drop the separate right here, and then we're going to put the combine right here. So let's just hold down the Control and Shift key and select the separate XYZ to preview it. Now, instead of using the waves, I'm going to use the mapping vector instead. And so I'm going to put the vector into the vector here, and that's just using the object coordinates. So now if I Control Shift select between the separate XYZ, we have the X-axis, so it's basically making a gradient, the Y-axis, which is making another gradient back and forth here, and then the Z-axis, which is making a gradient up and down, so it's breaking up those values. So what I'm going to do is put the X into the X, and then the Z is going to go into the Z, and let's just Control Shift select the noise texture to preview it. But for the Y, I'm going to instead use the color of the wave texture. So we're going to put this into the Y. So now if I take a look at the noise texture by Control Shift selecting it to preview it, it's being distorted on the Y axis by the wave texture, but the X and the Z are just using the normal mapping, which isn't distorted. So I'm just going to kind of drag this down and drag this down just so it's a bit smaller, kind of stick that together, and we'll drag this here and then drag the noise right over here. So you can now see that it's adding all those little like noisy waves, and there's like a bunch of little lines there. It almost looks like the pattern of like grains of wood, but that is going to make all those little scratches. Now I just want to make the scratches more contrasted, so they're just in some spots here and there. So I'm going to search for a color ramp and put that after the noise texture. And then what I'm going to do is drag the black tab over and drag the white tab over, and you can see by dragging these two values really close together, it's going to add a lot of contrast. So I'm going to drag this over kind of like there and over right there. So if I drag these really close to each other like this, you can see there's just going to be a few scratches here and there. Now we haven't actually changed the settings of the noise texture, so before we kind of play around with this color ramp, let's change the noise settings. So I'm going to click on the FBM here, and I'm going to change it to hetero terrain. Then I'm going to turn the scale to 8, and I'll turn the detail to 10, and I'll turn the roughness to 0.6. So now I can go back here to this color ramp. Now that the noise texture, it has a bit more detail, I can kind of drag around the color ramp here, and I'm going to put the black tab to about here, and then I'll drag the white tab over to about there. So now there's just a few scratches here and there, but if you want like more scratches, you could drag these over, or less scratches, you could drag this over. Now, to make this customizable outside of a node group, what I'm going to do is search for a hue saturation value and drop it before the color ramp. And we now have this value, and so if I drag this around more and more, if I drag it up and down, that's going to make the values lighter and darker, so you can have more scratches or less scratches. And then also, let's duplicate the hue saturation value by hitting Shift D, and we're going to drop it here after the color ramp. And then this one is also going to change the values, but it's just going to kind of fade them out or fade them back in because it's after the color ramp, which has already made it contrasted. So we'll be using both of these values later in the custom node group. So all of these textures right here, these are what are making up the scratches. So if I just click and drag to box select all of these nodes here, we'll hit Control J to give it a frame. I'll press F2 to give it a label, and I can just call this scratches. And then also this mapping here, we can change the scale to change all the scratches at once. We can also rotate the scratches if we want to, and also you could move the scratches around with the location. So that's it for the scratches texture. So let's drag the material output back, and we'll just drop the principled shader right here. Now I want the scratches to look like they're pushing back into the mesh. So I'm going to take this hue saturation value and put that into the normal, and then to convert this to bump data, we're going to search for a bump node and drop it here right there before the principled shader. And we want the hue saturation value color to be going into the height value to convert it to bump data. So now if I zoom in closely, you can see it looks like it's popping out of the mesh, but I'm going to click on invert so it looks like it's going back into the mesh instead. Now what I want to do is make it not quite as strong. First, let's change some of the principled settings though, so we can kind of see it a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is turn the metallic value all the way up to 1, and then I'll turn the roughness down a little bit. So now you can kind of see those scratches are really sharp, and so to make them a little bit less sharp, I'm going to turn this distance value to a 0.0006. So 0.3 zeros and then a 6. And so that's going to make the scratches more smooth. If I zoom in there, you can see they're a bit more smooth. And then we're also inverting it. And then also here on this strength value, we can control that to make it more or less bumpy. So I'm going to turn the bump strength to a 0.7. And I know right here on the distance, it says 0.001, but if you click on it, it's actually 0.0006. So now I want to add a little bit more noise just over the surface of the material. So we're going to create a node setup down here. So let's search for a noise texture. And we're also going to search for a color ramp. we'll drop that right there. And so what we want to do is take the original mapping and we're going to put the vector into the vector of the noise, and let's Control Shift select the noise texture, preview it, and I'll change some of the settings here. So let's zoom into this noise. So I'm going to turn the scale to 20. So the scale of 20 and the detail, we'll turn that to 10, and I'll turn the roughness up to 8.6 so it's more detailed. So now I want to drop the color ramp right here so we can preview it. And what I'm going to do is just take the black tab and drag it way over here so there's quite a bit more dark areas. So now what I'm going to do is put that into the bump. So let's just box select these nodes and drag them back a bit. And I'm going to duplicate this bump and drop it here, and then hit the backspace to reset the values. And I can take the color ramp color and we'll put that into the height value. And let's Control Shift select the principled shader to preview it. Now you can see it's way too strong. So what I'm going to do is take the bump strength and turn that down to a 0.07, which is a 0.07, and then I'll also invert it because I think that looks slightly better. So now you can see some parts are more smooth, but then other parts are more rough. And you can go back here to the color ramp and you can kind of drag this around and you can kind of change how rough you want it to be. So you can see by dragging this black tab around, there's going to be just a few areas which are bumpy, or if you drag this way out, there's a lot more areas which are bumpy. Now what I'm also going to do is add one more noise texture up here for the base color. So if I click on this noise texture, I'll press Control Shift D. So Control Shift D will duplicate the node, but keep this wire plugged up so it has the mapping. And let's just preview the noise texture. And I'm going to change these settings. So I'll turn the scale of this to 15. I'll leave the detail at 10, and I'll turn the roughness all the way up to 1, so it's very rough. And then the lacularity, I'm going to turn this up to a 3 instead. And the lacularity is kind of going to add a bunch of little dots, kind of like a dot pattern. So I'll just turn it up by a small amount. So now I want to create two different base colors. So I'm going to search for a mix color and drop it here after the noise, and the noise texture factor can go into the factor of the mix. And then I'll make two different kind of gray colors. They're going to be pretty subtle, but you can change this in the custom node group. So color A is going to be this very light gray, and the hex value is CB, CB, CB. And then here for this one, it's very similar, but it's a little bit darker, and the hex value is AD, AD, AD. So let's take the mix result here, and I can put this into the base color, and I can Control Shift select the principled shader to preview it. Also, to keep these really organized, I'll box select these nodes, join them into a frame, and I can add a label, and I can just call this color. We can box select these nodes, join them into a frame, add a label, and I can just call this like noise bump. So now what I also want to do is click on this bump node and duplicate it and drop it here in between these, and then hit the backspace to reset it. And then I want to take this mix here, which is the base color, and we're going to put the result here into the height value of this bump. But then let's make it very subtle by turning the bump strength to just a 0.01. So 0.01, and now we just have like a very subtle bump over the entire material. You can see I can turn it up and make it more bumpy, but I'm going to keep it really subtle. Let's box select these nodes here, so the 3 bumps, hit Control J, and then hit F2, and I can just call this bump, just to keep everything really organized so we know what everything does. Now, one more thing I'm going to do to make this material look really interesting is I'm going to have a little bit of variation in the roughness. So to do this, I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's drop it up here. And then I'm going to take the noise factor and I'm going to drag this all the way here and stick it into the roughness. So the light and dark values of the noise texture are going to determine how rough and shiny it's going to be, but it's too rough right now. So if we just drop the color ramp here in between this wire, that was the wrong wire. We want to drop it in this one here before the roughness. Now we can use the color ramp colors to make it more rough or more shiny. So I'm going to start by making these both kind of like mid-gray colors. And if you want to use the same hex values that I'm using, this one here is going to be a little bit of a darker gray, and this one is 7F, 7F, 7F. And then this other one here is slightly lighter, and this is going to be B8, B8, B8. So that's going to add a lot more variation. There's just going to be a little bit of variation in the roughness, so some parts look slightly more rough or more shiny. Now to control the roughness value in the custom node group, I can search for a hue saturation value, and we'll put this after the color ramp. And we now have a value that we can drag around, so that's going to make it lighter and darker, so it'll control the roughness. Now there's one more thing that I forgot to do, which really makes the material look a lot more interesting, and that is if I Control Shift select this noise texture here, you can see this noise texture is just pretty gray and it doesn't look that interesting. It doesn't have too much detail, but if I uncheck this normalize, that is going to make it look much more like that old Musgrave texture, which used to be in Blender, so it has really clear dark and light areas. So now if I Control Shift select the principled shader, if I zoom in here to the roughness, you can see it adds so much detail and it kind of looks like an old metal, whereas before it was just kind of gray. So turning off that normalize kind of gets that Musgrave effect and it makes it look so much more interesting. Now in the new Blender version of Blender 4.4, there was a new feature added to these bump nodes, and that that is this little filter width right here. Now, if I zoom way into one of these scratches, if I zoom way in, you can see it looks a little bit too detailed, and I kind of don't quite like how that looks. If I take this filter width and I turn it to a 10, that's going to kind of smooth things out a little bit and make it look slightly more lumpy. If I Control Shift select the bump to preview it, you can see here it is at the default. You can see it's almost like a little bit too detailed and too noisy. If I turn the filter width to 10, now you can see it's just a bit more smooth. And I think that makes the scratches look a lot better. So I'll Control Shift select the principal shader, and there we go. There is the finished procedural material. So let's now join it together into a node group. So I'm going to click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Control G to join it together into a node group. And for some reason, when I joined together into a node group, a few things were messed up. So if this was messed up, you can just kind of drag this over and fix this. Let's just drag these up here. And then also these two nodes, I can join them into a frame, add a label, and I can just call this roughness, because these two nodes are creating the roughness. So we have the roughness, the bump here, then we have the scratches, and we have the color and the noise bump. All right, so let's hit the tab key outside the node group, and I'll drag the node group right over here, and let's drag it out to make it bigger, and then I can copy the material name, and let's paste it here into the node group. So now right here, you can see it says BSDF, and I want to rename it to shader. So if I hit the tab key to go into the node group, I'm going to hit the N key to open up the side panel. And if you go to the group tab, I can double click on the sockets to rename it, and I'll just rename that to shader because I like that better. So now right over here, we have this group input, and we can plug up all the custom values to the group input. So this mapping is plugged up to all the textures. So this mapping scale will control the size of the entire material. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket. Let's click on the scale, and we want to make it one value instead of 3. So from vector, we'll change this to float, so it is one value. And then we need to turn the default value to 1. And then if we hit tab to go out of the node group, let's turn the scale back to 1. So let's go back into the node group. Then I want to control the scale of just the scratches, and so this mapping node here is only plugged up to the scratches textures. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket. Let's click on this, and again, we're going to change it to float. We'll turn the default value to 1. Also right here, I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to scratches scale. And then if I hit tab to go out of the node group, we'll turn the scale back to 1. So now let's go back into the node group. Then I want to control the amount of scratches. So I'm going to drag the group input kind of right up here, and we're going to take this value from the hue saturation value. You can see the value is going to add more scratches or less scratches. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to scratches amount. Then I want to be able to control kind of like the size or the length of the scratches. And so you can see we have this other hue saturation value, and this hue saturation value kind of makes it look like the scratches are less long and kind of makes them less visible. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to scratches size 1. Now also, if I take this noise texture roughness and drag this up and down, you can see that is going to kind of change the size of the scratches as well. If I just Control Shift select the color to preview it, and then change this roughness, you can see that's kind of changing the size of the scratches. So I'm just going to preview the principal shader, and let's take this noise texture roughness, and I'll put that into the extra socket. And then this one I'm going to rename to scratches size 2. Then I want to control the colors, so let's just take the mix here. We'll take color A, put that into the extra socket, and color B, and I can just rename this to color 1 and color 2. Then I want to control the metallic value, so I'll drag the group input way over here next to the principal shader, and I'll put the metallic into the extra socket. Then let's drag the group input way down here behind this bottom noise texture, and I'm going to put the scale and the detail into these extra sockets, and also let's put this roughness into the extra socket as well. And then I'll just add the word noise at the very end of this, so noise scale, noise detail, and noise roughness. Then I want to control the roughness of the material. You can see this node here got put into the frame, so I'll just hit Alt P to bring it out of the frame, and we'll drag the node group right over here. And so we want to plug the roughness value up, and so you can see there's this hue saturation value, and the value is going to make the roughness map lighter and darker. So we'll put the value into the extra socket, and then we can rename this to roughness. And then I want to control the bump strengths, so we'll drag this right down here underneath the bumps. And the first one is going to be the scratches. You can see the scratches more and less, so put the strength into the extra socket, and let's double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to scratches bump strength. And then this one here, that's going to be the noise, and then also this one is more noise. So I'll put the strength into the extra socket, and this one into the extra socket. And so I'm going to rename this one noise bump strength 1, and then this one I'm going to rename to noise bump strength 2. And then finally, I want to control the rotation of the scratches. So let's drag this way back here to the very end of the node setup. And then right here, this mapping, this one, we want to use the second one because that's controlling just the rotation of the scratches. So we can take the rotation and put that into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'll just rename it to scratches rotation. So let's hit the N key to close the side panel, and I can hit the tab key to go outside the node group. Let's just make this bigger and we can review the final material. So we have the scale to change the size of the entire material. Then we just have the scale of the scratches, and let's just take the scratches bump strength and turn that higher to like maybe a 5 so you can kind of see it better. So we have the scratches scale, then we have the amount of scratches, we have the scratches size 1, and also the scratches size 2. Then we have a few different colors for the metal. You could also like take one of the colors and you could make it maybe like a reddish color to make it look maybe a bit old and worn, or kind of have like some rust or some dirt. We also have the metallic material, so you can make it metal. Then we also just have the noise scale, noise detail, and noise roughness. We also have the roughness of the metal to make it rough or shiny. And then we have the scratches bump strength. I like to keep it kind of subtle, just at like a 0.7, but you can kind of see if I zoom in there, the scratches are more visible. And then we have the noise bump strength, and then we have noise bump strength 2. And then finally, we have the rotation, so you can change the rotation of the scratches. So on default, it's going vertically, but you can change that if you want to, kind of rotate it around. So that's how you create this procedural material. So I hope you found the video helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can purchase it with the links in the description. You can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack to purchase all of my procedural materials, and that's a great way to help support me and this channel so I can keep on creating these free videos. And to learn how to create more procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist. So I hope you found the video helpful, and thank you for watching.